Normally containing only a little over 100 people at any given time, the 1686 French settlement of Poste, Arkansas, has been at the forefront of some of the greatest land transactions in history. On March 2, 1819, the United States territory of Arkansas came into existence, and Arkansas Post was made the territory's first capital. But in 1821, the capital was moved upriver. To learn more about the post and find out why it was moved, I'm going to follow in the footsteps of daring explorers, consult an expert on the New Madrid earthquake, and travel the information superhighway to disclose the names of early leaders. So watch out. History's coming. Whoa, big snake! At the edge of this water, the site of the first permanent European settlement west of the Mississippi River was founded. Hi, I'm Rob Reep, and I've come near the mouth of the Arkansas River to unearth the story of Arkansas Post, the fort and once great trading center. In the mid-1600s, French explorer Robert de La Salle understood the importance of the Mississippi River. He devised a plan to gain control of the father of all waters for his beloved France. In 1682, La Salle and his lieutenant, Henri de Tonti, an Italian by birth, along with 50 men, explored the southern portion of the Mississippi River. Along the way, they established relations with Native Americans of the area. The expedition held ceremonies to claim the land for France. One of those ceremonies was held at the site that would later be known as Arkansas Post. In that same year, de Tonti received a land grant in the area from La Salle, near the Quapaw village of Osatoy. In 1683, La Salle returned to France to recruit colonists and secure supplies, with plans to return via the Gulf of Mexico to the mouth of the Mississippi River, where he would found a city. On July 24, 1684, La Salle departed from France with 300 colonists and 4 ships. One of those ships was lost to pirates. The 3 remaining ships accidentally passed the mouth of the Mississippi and went on to the Texas coast. 2 of the ships sank during a storm in Matagorda Bay. The lone surviving ship, the La Belle, wrecked along the Texas coast. La Salle and the crew were able to reach the shore and established Fort St. Louis, Texas. In those days, La Salle had no way to communicate. The fate of La Salle remained a mystery to de Tonti. De Tonti waited on La Salle for 2 years on the banks of the Mississippi River, where St. Louis is today. What happened to La Salle? Growing anxious, de Tonti and his men traveled on down the Mississippi to a place where the Arkansas and Mississippi rivers meet, just a few miles southeast of where I'm standing. In 1686, de Tonti and his men camped there where they would carve out a tiny fort and trading post. Let's go inside the Arkansas Post National Memorial to learn more. I've arranged a meeting with Park Ranger Jody Morris to learn more about Arkansas Post. I'm looking for information on Arkansas Post, and one of the questions that I'm hoping that you can answer for me is, what was here before Europeans arrived?
American Indians and lots of wildlife. Indians had lived in this area for centuries before Europeans arrived. When the French came, who settled Arkansas Post, the Quapaw lived in several villages near the mouth of the Arkansas River. Another name for the Quapaw is the Arkansas, and that's where the name for the state of Arkansas comes from.
Why here? Why this place?
Well, number one reason is because of the rivers. And for the Indians, the French, the Spanish, and later the Americans, the rivers were a critical strategic part of this location because it was the highway of that time period. It was the way you traveled and traded and carried goods. It was the road into Arkansas. At this location, you're on the Arkansas River, and you also have nearby access to the White River, and through that, and through either the Arkansas or the White, access to the Mississippi River. So it's that three-river location.
The post became a popular rendezvous point for French coureurs de bois and Native Americans.
Fur trade has always been an integral part of Arkansas's economy. Now, the original Native Americans that lived in this area, the Quapaw, preferred buffalo and deer skin for their hides. But when the French coureurs de bois arrived, they wanted beaver pelts to make beaver felt hats.
Though you can't tell by looking at it today, Arkansas Post grew to a population of a little over 1,000 and had quite a thriving little community, with a bank, a tavern, and a newspaper.
I'll come over here and take a look at this. This is an actual dugout canoe from the same time period that Detani and his men would have come down the Mississippi River. In all likelihood, this is how they traveled.
These canoes were made by digging out the center of a single log, and from the looks of this one, there was not a lot of room. So how did Detani and his men carry enough food? They didn't. They hunted and gathered food as they went along. White-tailed deer, turkeys, and other wild game were plentiful in the area. They may have even traded with Native Americans for corn, beans, and squash. In my research for information about Detani and Arkansas Post, I ran across this account, written 145 years earlier, by one of the men who accompanied the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto to the same region.
It's very clear by this account that De Soto, and no doubt Detani and his men, would have encountered many plants, animals, and even fish that they had never before seen in Europe. Just listen to this account that I found. There was a fish which they called bagris. The third part of it was head, and it had on both sides the gills, and along the sides great pricks like very sharp awls. Those of the kind that were in the lakes were as big as pikes, and in the river there were some of 100 and 150 pounds weight, and many of them were taken with the hook. It sounds more like a monster to me, but I think it's time that we go and try to find out just what kind of fish this truly was.
To solve this mystery, I've arranged a meeting with the Director of Aquaculture at the Arkansas Agriculture Department, Ted McNulty.
Mr. McNulty, I'm on a quest to find a fish that meets the description of a 1541 journal written by a Spanish explorer. He recorded that the fish was found in both rivers and lakes of the area, and that its head was 1/3 the size of its body, and it had great awl-like pricks. As an aquaculture specialist, do you think you can help me find a fish like this today?
Sure, Rob. I'm sure it's a catfish.
Now, from what I've read, this fish was a major part of the Native American diet in the area, and probably even a big part of the diet of those explorers.
That's true. In fact, catfish is still...
Mr. McNulty went on to explain that catfish farming still today plays a special role in Arkansas's economy.
Oh, wait, I've heard of farming rice and cotton, but catfish, how does that work?
Rob, if you'll follow me, I'll show you.
When we arrived at the hatchery, Mr. McNulty introduced me to my tour guide, University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff Aquaculture Station Manager, Bauer Duke.
So what catfish farmers do is they have specific ponds set up for spawning, and they put their broodstock out into these ponds, usually one male for every 2 females. And then as it gets warmer, the broodstock will start to spawn.
Mr. Duke explained that catfish are cavity spawners. In other words, they spawn in small, safe, basically cave-like areas. The catfish farmers provide this for them by placing hole-like cans in the water. The farmers then check the cans for eggs and manually remove them and bring them into the hatchery. Mr. Duke happened to have a bucket of eggs that I could see and examine.
And these masses are kind of stuck together like glue, or with a glue. And you can see that these are a little bit older. they're wiggling around already. So these are a few days old.
They're kind of gooey.
Yeah, it's kind of like Jell-O, and so that's what holds everything together. These eggs will then fit into the basket, like so.
After the fish have hatched, they naturally begin to grow. They will be ready to move to the pond when they look like these shown on the right. When we arrived at the ponds, Mr. Duke tossed in some catfish feed. Within seconds, the catfish began to swarm. Mr. Duke went on to explain that the catfish here are channel catfish, sold on average between 1.2 and 2 pounds, making them much smaller than the fish I'm looking for. However, he suggested I check out a blue catfish, and I know just the place to find one. I've arranged a meeting with Gordon Bagby at the Whit Stevens Jr. Central Arkansas Nature Center.
I'm looking for a fish that's native to Arkansas that was described in a 16th century journal written by a Spanish explorer who was traveling with De Soto. Now, in the account, he says that the fish itself weighed from 100 to 150 pounds. It had a head that was 1/3 the size of its body, gills on both sides, and had great awl-like pricks. Do you think you can help me find a fish that might match this description?
Let's step over to our aquarium and take a look.
Sounds great. Wow, are all of these fish native to Arkansas?
Most are. We have a few that are not, but most of these are.
It's very impressive. Any of these fish could have been a good food source for Datani and his men, but which one of these is the blue catfish?
The blue catfish is the largest fish in the aquarium, and it usually stays near the bottom and towards the back of this tank.
Let's compare it to the account. Its head is 1/3 the size of its body. It has gills on both sides. There's those awl-like pricks.
How much does this blue catfish weigh approximately?
This one weighs about 15 to 20 pounds.
Is it possible for a blue catfish to weigh maybe 100, possibly even 150 pounds?
Yes, it sure is.
In your opinion, is there any other fish that might meet that 16th century description?
Well, it could be a flathead catfish, but in any event, either way, it's a catfish.
So we're pretty certain that the fish described in that 16th century journal is either a blue or a flathead catfish. And even though Datani and his men came to the region much later, it's pretty safe to say that they relied on these fish as a food source.
With that mystery solved, I think it's time I learn a little more about early life at Arkansas Post for Datani and his men. So I've decided to take a camping trip. As I shove off, it dawns on me how Europeans traveled throughout this area. Just like the natives, rivers were the main means of transportation. They were the highways of the 17th century. This isn't my first time in a boat, and I'm in pretty good shape. But just after a few minutes of battling the wind and current, my arms began to get tired. The men that traveled with Datani needed to be in very good shape to tackle the everyday trials the explorers faced. Most of them were single men between the ages of 16 to 30 in search of adventure or fleeing their past. Datani and his 6 crew members were seasoned explorers. After all, since 1678, Datani had been in charge of several French forts in the Great Lakes region. In other words, these men were survival experts. Much like them, the first thing I need to do is find safe shelter for the night. With my feet on dry land and my boat pulled on shore, I grab my rucksack. Hopefully, with just a short hike, I can find a good spot to set up camp. But trekking through Arkansas forest is sometimes not an easy task.
I'm in a fairly low area near the river, and the sun is starting to set. I need to find shelter on high ground, and fast. Whoa, big snake! This looks like a fairly good place to set up camp. I brought with me basic supplies, rope, some canvas, and wool for bedding. We'll set up for the night and see how it goes.
Before wooden structures could have been constructed, Datani and his men probably relied on tents for shelter. During the day, they would have been busy gathering wood for a campfire, hunting wild game, and gathering native plants for food. But as the sun set behind the trees and the sky grew dark, idleness of nightlife in the camp provoked the mind to wonder, causing it to be the most difficult time of day. 2 years had passed since they had last seen LaSalle.
Had he abandoned them? Had he even made it back to France? Or possibly, had natives killed him?
The answers lay far southwest on the Texas coast. After the LaBelle ran aground, LaSalle led a group northeast on 3 separate occasions, attempting to locate the Mississippi River. His 36 followers mutinied near Navasota, Texas. On March 19, 1687, LaSalle was murdered by one of his followers, Pierre de Haut. But the fate of LaSalle remained a mystery to Datani. Leaving behind 6 men at the place he called Arkansas Post, he set out in search of an answer and headed back to France. It was there Datani learned of his leader's tragic fate. Datani's meager little settlement, which had once been farmed and hunted by the Quapaw, was on the eve of its own awakening. It was about to be a part of one of the greatest events in American history. In 1803, this quiet wilderness barely noticed that it was part of the greatest land deal of all time, the Louisiana Purchase, an event that set in motion a new path for the tiny little post. The Louisiana Purchase was divided into 2 regions. The southern part was called Orleans. The northern portion, of which present-day Arkansas is a part, was called the Territory of Louisiana. In 1812, Orleans became a state and was renamed Louisiana. Out of the northern portion, the new territory of Missouri was created. 1 year later, in 1813, the Missouri Territory was redrawn, with the addition of a new county called Arkansas. It was during the Missouri Territorial period that Arkansas experienced a boost in population as a result of 2 very different events: the New Madrid earthquake and the War of 1812. If I want to learn more about the New Madrid earthquake, I've got to meet with someone trained in the field of physical science and geology. Felicia Doster, a veteran scientist of over 25 years, has agreed to meet with me. With her expertise, she brings a scientific rather than a historic perspective into my investigation.
Wow, I can see why they call Arkansas the natural state. This is absolutely gorgeous.
It certainly is, Rob.
But I have to wonder, what would make people in the early 1800s move into this wilderness and settle?
Well, Rob, in 1811, we have what was called the Big One hit.
And by the big one, you mean what?
The Big One was an earthquake that occurred on the New Madrid fault line in 1811. They had aftershocks in that area that occurred for up to 5 months after the initial impact.
Just out of curiosity, how big was this on the Richter scale?
Rob, at that time we didn't have the Richter scale, but if we had have had a Richter scale, it would have registered 8 point or larger on the scale.
So this is not your ordinary earthquake.
Oh, not at all, Rob.
What did that do to the region?
Eyewitnesses say that the bluffs in the area literally crumbled to rubble, and that the land would swell and fall very much like what you would see if you were looking across at the ocean waves. And some of the eyewitnesses in this area actually said that the river flowed backwards as the land would uplift and then drop out from under it.
Speaking of the Mississippi River, a lot of people say it went backwards. Now, if it was able to do that kind of damage and make a river that size change course completely, turn around and go backwards, it must have been felt in other places.
Definitely, Rob. We have reports that say that the shocks were felt as far north as Canada and as far south as New Orleans. We even have church bells that rang in Boston. This was a definite impact on this area.
Okay, I have a question. We've had larger earthquakes in the United States, larger than 8.0. Why was this one felt so far away?
You have a lot of fractures that exist in California, and so therefore a quake of this size would not carry as far, say, as it did here on the New Madrid fault line.
To better understand the composition of the Earth's crust, take a look at this map. Compare a 6.8 magnitude earthquake that took place 84 years after the big one, and a 1994 quake of 6.7 magnitude in California. Soil composition in the New Madrid area allows the shocks of quakes to be felt at much greater distances. Mrs. Dahlstrom went on to explain that near the epicenter at New Madrid, whole farms were swallowed up, and that's when the government stepped in, turning everyone's attention to the west. They encouraged westward expansion by offering 2 million acres of free land in Arkansas to the earthquake victims. Land grants were also given as bonuses to the veterans of the War of 1812. Before those grants could be made, land had to be surveyed. To learn more about the original survey, I've come to the Louisiana Purchase Historical State Park, located about 15 miles northwest of Marville, Arkansas. A team of surveyors marked a line north from the mouth of the Arkansas River, while another survey group marked a line west from the mouth of the St. Francis River.
As you can see, I'm walking over a swamp, and you're probably wondering just what I'm doing here.
This stone marks the point where the two lines intersect. It is the starting point for the measuring of all land in Arkansas and the rest of the northern portion of the entire Louisiana Purchase.
Those surveyors must have had my kind of luck, because wouldn't you know that those two lines would meet in the middle of a swamp?
But I'm wondering, just how important was this point for those men to have braved a swamp filled with cottonmouths and mosquitoes? This survey encouraged even more westward movement. By 1818, it was estimated that about 3,000 white and black settlers lived in the area. 2 years later, in 1820, the national census reported a population of 14,273. It was this increase that prompted Arkansas to consider separating from Missouri and becoming its own territory.
So here's the answer to our question. The settlement of the American West began right here. So on the nation's 43rd birthday, July 4th, 1819, Arkansas Territory came into existence, and Arkansas Post was made the territory's first capital.
President Monroe sent the territory its first governor. He appointed James Miller, an Army general, to serve as Arkansas's first territorial governor. Miller was from New Hampshire and was a hero of the Battle of Lundy Lane in the War of 1812. Robert Crittenden, a 22-year-old lawyer from Kentucky, was appointed to serve as Secretary of the Territory. He, too, was a veteran of the War of 1812. It was Crittenden in November of 1819 who ordered an election of the Territory's first General Assembly. That General Assembly was bicameral. In other words, it had two houses. The Legislative Council was made up of 5 men, one from each of the 5 counties. The House of Representatives consisted of 9 men, chosen from the counties based on population.
I'm on Main Street of downtown Arkansas Post, but it doesn't look like much of a main street though, does it? But believe it or not, William Montgomery owned a tavern that stood about 50 yards behind me.
The Arkansas Territorial Legislature rented a room in the tavern from which they conducted territorial business from which one key politician was missing. Governor Miller, who was appointed in July, didn't leave for Arkansas until October. He arrived 70 days later, the day after Christmas, carrying a flag that said, "I'll try, sir." We knew that Governor Miller was not present at the first meeting of the Territorial General Assembly. But who was?
Today, unlike Governor Miller, I can actually travel great distances at lightning speed via the internet to conduct my research. So let's see what we can find.
The first Territorial General Assembly convened on July 28th and adjourned on August 3rd, 5 months before Governor Miller even arrived. Secretary Robert Crittenden served as acting governor at that first meeting. Here it shows the council speaker, I sit the clerk, and here are the names of the 3 judges of the territory's Supreme Court. The following year, the General Assembly met twice at the post. By this time, it appears that counties sent representatives. In the council, which we would call the Senate today, I see where each county had equal representation. But in the House of Representatives, the number of delegates was based on population. Almost immediately, the fate of Arkansas Post as a capital was in jeopardy. Threats of flooding and malaria-carrying mosquitoes plagued the settlement, and it met disfavor from territorial leaders who desired a more central location for the capital.
It was clear that the capital would be moved, but where would the path of power lead?